Is political gridlock in Northern Ireland over? Why are universities struggling financially? And should tech companies be allowed to put chips into humans? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Observer columnist and commentator Sonia Soda, and Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery. Today, after 2 years of stalemate, could politicians in Northern Ireland be getting back to work?
This package, I believe, safeguards Northern Ireland's place in the Union and will restore our place within the UK internal market.
It all started with a row over customs checks. So what's been decided and how will it affect trade across the UK? Have our universities become too reliant on foreign students to balance the books? Should silent prayer be allowed outside abortion clinics? And would you let this man put a chip in your brain? Well, let's start with that question you just heard there in the headlines. This is the story covered by BBC News. Elon Musk announces first Neuralink wireless brain chip implant. The tech billionaire Elon Musk says the wireless brain chip is designed to allow paralysed people to control devices with their thoughts. Would you let Elon Musk put a chip in your brain, Matt?
I think if I was suffering from one of those conditions, I probably would, actually, if it genuinely helped. I'm not sure that I want to go down the full cyborg route. I think this is definitely something where there is a big role for regulation. And let's hope we don't run too quickly.
But with some of your colleagues, how would we tell?
Very provocative, Stella. What about you? What are your thoughts on the idea of Elon Musk putting a chip in your brain?
I think we all have Twitter too much in our minds as it is. Seriously, scientific research is incredible, isn't it, what it can do? And if this can help people who are paralysed, what an amazing thing. But what we've already seen in America is very real concerns about the impact of this. And he's been testing it on chimps, and there's already been all sorts of horror stories about the impact that it's had. So I think proceed with caution is an understandable thing, and heavy, heavy regulation, because you are talking about messing with people's brains.
Would you allow Elon Musk to put a chip in your brain, or is it, or should it be left to medical scientists to do these sorts of things?
I mean, I think if I was paralysed, I'd much prefer it if it was coming from, you know, a certified medical research company. It's obviously an amazing technology, but I think there are huge privacy implications. It essentially would give Elon Musk a window into your brain, and I'm not sure I trust him with that. But also, I just think this is an example of how, you know, with the pace of technological development we're seeing, and it's just amazing, you know, AI is one aspect of it, but there's lots of others. It's outpacing our capacity to A, regulate, but B, sometimes even talk about some of the basic ethics, because it's amazing to do it for paralysed people. But, you know, how far does it go?
Well, you're nodding away there. I mean, initially, the question is about whether you would allow Elon Musk to put a chip in your brain. If you would like or could see yourself having a chip in your brain, would you be happy for someone else to do it?
I think the last time I was on the programme, Jo, the question was, it was in the wake of the AI summit, and it was whether Elon Musk was more powerful than Rishi Sunak, because, you know...
You've got a good memory.
Is that what the chips do?
Something like that. But no, I think exactly what Matt said. I think some of this technology for people who have, you know, they may not be able to speak properly, whatever, you can see the advantage. But as Stella said, you know, I want it thoroughly tested before, you know, I would want it near me or anyone I loved. And the problem is, exactly, as Sonia says, we're moral infants and technological giants in a way. We aren't looking at the ethical implications of so much of this technology. But I should think for the whips running Stella and Matt, they would love the idea of being able to put chips in MPs' heads and little mild shocks if you don't vote with the government.
Let's not make those dangerous suggestions here in the political... Exactly. We're going to talk about Northern Ireland, because after 2 years of political deadlock there, the Democratic Unionist Party has endorsed a deal to restore power sharing at Stormont. Let's have a look at the BBC's live blog. You can see Sir Geoffrey Donaldson there, the DUP leader, says deal with Westminster is good outcome for Northern Ireland. The BBC's deputy political editor Vicky Young joins us now. Vicky, just remind everybody why the DUP had been boycotting Stormont.
Yeah, I mean, this all goes back to those days of the Brexit deal, Jo. I'm sure you can remember all of that. Boris Johnson, Brexiteers, wanting the ability for the UK to be able to move away from EU rules. The EU saying, hang on a minute, there's an issue here because Northern Ireland shares a border with Ireland. That's in the EU. We have to have some checks on goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to make sure that it doesn't end up in the single market. Now, that effectively for some meant a border down the Irish Sea. It meant Northern Ireland being treated differently. And the DUP really felt that that, was a threat to Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom as part of the Union. So they've been deeply unhappy, as you say, 2 years this has been going on. And for the people of Northern Ireland, of course, having no one making decisions, very important decisions about what goes on there.
There were other reasons, of course, also suggested, and that's because the First Minister, a new First Minister, would be Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin for the first time, in fact, from an Irish nationalist party. That was always denied. What was the sort of truth behind that, Vicky?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the issue is there. Of course, they wouldn't say that that was the reason, but I think you can put it that there probably wasn't a huge incentive for the DUP to rush into power sharing when they were no longer in charge, if you like. But obviously, something has changed. We're in a slightly weird position here because we've got the reaction, if you like, from the DUP. What we don't have is the detail. We've just heard from Chris Heaton-Harris. He's the Northern Ireland Secretary. Hasn't shed much light on any of this, really. What's actually in this deal? I think the question is going to be, Jeffrey Donaldson has said, look, there's going to be no checks, there's going to be no paperwork on goods that are going from GB into Northern Ireland if they're going to stay there. We don't know if that is the case, but he says that is what's going to happen. We're not going to find out the details till tomorrow. The EU say, well, they're not going to give a running commentary on all of this, but they do expect the UK to really stick by and honour its agreement on Brexit. And I think there's going to be a question for Brexiteers in the Tory party here. Does this mean that the rest of the UK can still diverge to move away from EU rules? So until we see the detail, it's going to be hard to know. But Mr Heaton-Harris has confirmed £3 billion, more than £3 billion, available to an incoming new power-sharing government in Northern Ireland.
Now, Vicky Young, thank you very much. We'll come back to the question about divergence. But first of all, just your reaction that gridlock could be over, a return to power sharing.
Well, it's obviously really good news if that is the case, and we do need to see the details of the deal. But the reality of this is that this is 2 years of tragedy for the people of Northern Ireland who have had to live without a functioning government. Is not a political success story forever. So better late than never, I think, would be my overall reaction, but good news on the day.
Stella?
It's longer than 2 years that the people of Northern Ireland have had to put up with this situation. And obviously it's very welcome if there's finally been a breakthrough in the impasse. The trouble is we need to see the details, because the worst thing in the world, and it doesn't make any sense unless this government has now committed to regulatory alignment with the European Union, which I'm pretty sure some on your benches will not be happy with, to make good on the promises. The worst thing in the world would be a false dawn, because a series of promises have been made that they will then renege on. And unfortunately, this government does have form in that. The people of Northern Ireland are crying out for leadership at a local level. Daily services are completely broken. There's a deep frustration amongst the people there in the political process. So the worst thing in the world could be if actually what we're hearing now is smoke and mirrors and not a reality, of some tough choices being made about either regulatory alignment or being honest that those stickers that say not for the EU are going to have to continue, because there isn't any technology that can make up for the fact that we left the European Union and now we have a border between on the Irish land.
Well, I think it is important to say that the other parties have been kept involved. There is commitment to parliamentary scrutiny for this, and obviously that deal, that treaty with the EU, is not something that we're going to be able to rewrite in this process. So there's a long way to go, but I think we should be optimistic at this stage.
Right. I mean, Sonia, looking at this, it's difficult to know what can have changed because there have been various agreements which did mean that Northern Ireland would stay in the orbit of the EU for customs, for goods, because they share a border. And that is what upset the Democratic Unionist Party. They felt that those checks that would be going down the Irish Sea would separate, further separate, in their minds, Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. But like, as in all agreements, if they've pulled one way, then surely the other end of the agreement is going to be fraying at the edges. So I'm interested to know your thoughts about what could have been agreed that has satisfied the DUP, that will still keep the arrangements in line with what the EU understands in terms of the single market, never mind the right wing of the Brexiteers on the right wing of the Conservative Party.
Well, I think we have to hope that some solution has been found, but I think your question actually gets to the heart of it, which it was always a conundrum. You can't leave the EU and eliminate the need for any sorts of customs checks altogether somewhere on the border of Ireland, on the island of Ireland, or somewhere down the Irish Sea. So it's hard to see that there's no way, it's as Stella says, there's no way of magicking that conundrum away. It exists. So I think it's a question of if, after, and this latest round of Stormont not sitting is 2 years, but even longer in the past, as Stella said, if people have just, there's just too much political pressure now, because people have been without a government locally, and that's having all sorts of effects, as Stella has said. I mean, we heard from a Postmaster General on the radio this morning on the Today programme. There has been no equivalent law on justice for them proposed because there is no assembly sitting. So it's affecting all. So I think what you have to hope is that this has been going on so long that some people just bend a little bit more at the edges. But I have to say, this was a cost of Brexit that was denied during the referendum, and straight after the referendum, Boris Johnson, he was asked about whether there would be the need for checks down the Irish Sea, and he lied. He said no. I mean, he must have known that they were required.
Well,
so,
Tim, cost of Brexit.
Well, look, I think if you look back at the Good Friday Agreement, if you look at how we have handled Northern Ireland, there's always been that great British art of diplomacy, of fudging. We haven't had things written down in lots of things done about the decommissioning of weapons. They were there in print, but it was never really specified. And of course, the EU is a very different kind of institution.
Yeah, it's a rules-based.
It's a legal, rules-based institution.
But we knew that.
I think there was a naivety on the part of Brexiteers like myself about how flexible the EU would have been about that. They are flexible when they want to be, and some of their trade relations around the world, they institute regimes which are more tolerant, let's say. But in Northern Ireland, they played hardball. And I think your question to Sonia really is an incredibly important one. What might emerge in the next few days, few hours, or whatever? How much fudge is there in this arrangement? Because I think the EU is not blind to the difficulties of this as well. They don't want the political problems in Northern Ireland, and I suspect there's been a bit of give and take on everyone's side.
Sorry, Tim, but this is exactly why the Good Friday Agreement is at risk, because of the antics of the Brexiteers. And it's not just on the border, it's also on things like the Rwanda Bill, which specifically denies certain rights to people that were part of being... Yeah. Well, it's all part of being part of a...
Let's stick with this for our viewers.
But it's the same principle, which is that we act as if international law doesn't matter when it suits us, and we demand it of other people. And the consequences of the people of Northern Ireland are what you are seeing. And it's not just the fact that we have a border, it's the fact that we are now in a situation where our own government is being taken to court because we don't uphold. We signed up to the Good Friday Agreement to uphold directly the rights, and actually the rights that they're talking about are written into the Good Friday Agreement. We can't say we didn't know.
It's true, Stella, but it's also the case is that the EU have been...
You can't keep blaming the EU for everything.
Well, no, you can't. And I'm trying to be
mess of our own making.
Let him answer.
The EU is has been inspecting goods crossing the Irish, and an intensity that they do not do in almost any other part of the world. There has got to be give and take in both sides, and the EU hasn't always shown that.
Let's take that thought a bit further, because this headline in Politico, Britain's Brexit border is finally here and no one is happy. This is also about post-Brexit trade, because there are going to be new controls from tomorrow on animal and plant goods coming from the EU. It means products deemed medium or high risk will need to have a health certificate before they can be transported to the UK. If no one is happy, have we got a dud deal on this as well?
I think what that report reflects is that this is going to be a new system and people don't yet know what the details of it look like, and they don't yet know what those potential delays might be. In reality, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. There was always going to be a system that had to handle this kind of cross-border trade. It has been delayed several times in a bid to try and get it right. And as I say, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
Yeah, but I mean, you've already got trade groups warning the measures will curtail imports, increase food inflation and reduce food security.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I'm not denying those for a second, but I think those warnings are legitimate things to raise. They're a legitimate consequence of the deal that has been done, but we shouldn't assume that it won't work just before it's even started.
Of course they will, because the Brexit that was pursued was to put up trade barriers, which has a damaging impact on exports and imports. So this idea, and this was the issue with the campaign for Brexit, which is that people were told there are no trade-offs, it's all going to be amazing, it's going to fix all these long-term structural issues in our economy that have got nothing to do with Brexit, it's going to free up money for the NHS. They were not told that there is a cost to erecting trade barriers with our biggest trading bloc. It has a cost. It's made us poor as a nation. It will continue to do so through measures like this, just at a time when we can't afford it. It is the reality of Brexit.
Well, what are the benefits of Brexit then in this regard?
Well, if you look, Sonia is right. There hasn't always been honesty on either side. I think sometimes us Brexiteers gave the impression that there were no costs. This latest thing is a cost. It's going to hurt people. There's been costs for small businesses that have hurt people. But you look also at the EU, they've just taken on a huge amount of debt across the EU institution because of some of the structural adjustment. Britain isn't part of that debt thing anymore. You look at the overall British economic performance since we left Brexit, we're basically on par with other European countries. Despite all the sort of downside, we've actually grown slightly better than Germany recently, etc. The fact that there are costs, there are benefits. My regret about Brexit is I don't think we have taken full advantage of some of the freedoms that we've got. But the overall picture, if you look at the macro situation, is Britain hasn't really suffered from Brexit despite all of the negative things from the Remain side.
Sorry, hang on, Stella, let you respond and then I'll come on to something specific.
I like turnips, I like porridge, but I don't really want to spend a summer having those being the only things we can eat, because this government of its own making... Tim, what you are talking about is entirely a project of our own making. So we have said checks from tomorrow, that's going to cost importers £73 a time on food, and then in April there's supposed to be a charge coming in on top of that. Nobody knows what the charge is. We're talking about in less than 90 days, the vast majority of our food, which comes in and out of this country, being subject to a price.
And would Labour reverse it? Would Labour reverse these
So you bring it.
checks?
So an SPS deal, the veterinary deal with Customs, is also joining the pan-European Mediterranean.
But would you reverse all of these things because you see that
Jo,
obviously is very negative?
Absolutely, and we've already said we do an SPS deal. I am chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. We are absolutely campaigning to get rid of this Brexit border tax because we will see food shortages. We will see food inflation. Yes, we will. The hauliers are telling about a 70-mile long queue.
0.22% or something
over
of the
3
cost of
years.
food.
Nobody wants to be honest about what impact it's going to have on inflation. At least Matt is honest to say, yeah, there will be food shortages and food delays as a result.
That's not quite what I said, that's not quite what I said.
Because nobody even knows what this is going to be. We're talking about a scheme coming in tomorrow, and the people bringing in food have no idea what they're going to be charged.
The only thing is, it could level the playing field because good news for British farmers who've been having to do these checks to export their goods to Europe since 2021. Will this just not even things out?
No, because only 30% of goods are going to be checked anyway, if you can get the lorries to go all the way to Sevington. And everyone who knows that area knows there's lots of different routes off. And we're not even talking about the system that's supposed to be coming in October, where everything is going to be checked, which is 21 million extra customs declarations. That's double the number of tax declarations this country has on a system that hasn't even been built yet. It is mad, it is chaos, and it should be stopped.
Right, should it be stopped?
What you've heard from Stella is an articulation of the ultra worst case scenario that has none of the discussions about the benefits potentially that Tim mentioned as well. The reality is that the conversation about Brexit was always about saying the deal with the EU does not take into account the fact that there could be something better with the wider world out there. That necessarily means making things harder with the European Union and making things easier elsewhere. We're not at the point where we can actually say how hard that process with the EU is going to be, or how easy and successful it's going to be with the rest of it.
It's in 90 days. Surely businesses need to know what they're planning for to pay in extra charges in 90 days. And you can't even say that. I asked the Minister on the record about this 2 weeks ago, and she said, oh, yeah, we don't know what we're going to charge them yet, but it's definitely not going to cover fruit and veg. And then 2 days later, she says, oh, actually, it is going to cover fruit and veg. It's chaos. It's mad. It has to be stopped because we are all going to pay much more for our food, and there will be food shortages. And if you want to rule those out, do it now.
This is just a rejoining argument, Stella.
Like
that's fine.
Let me be absolutely clear.
That's all you're doing.
Let me be clear for avoidance. I'm not arguing for rejoin.
If it isn't a rejoining argument, you would like to see these checks reversed?
This is a choice. And so, for example, if we have just signed up to regulatory alignment to ease the situation in Northern Ireland, that would be one of the things that would mean that you wouldn't need all of this.
Is that going to be disappointing to Brexiteers like you if, in fact, that is what's part of this deal with Northern Ireland? It's actually going to be closer alignment with the EU, rightly or wrongly, and actually these checks will prove that that was the right way to go.
I think if it is a very legalistic realignment with the EU, that would be a disappointment. And I can understand why people will have signed up to it to make the Northern Ireland institutions work. But no, if that is where we've ended up, and it isn't a bit of the fudge that I was describing earlier, that will be a disappointment, yeah.
Sonia, finally?
What I just don't understand is why regulatory alignment with the EU is bad, but regulatory alignment with elsewhere, you know, places like America where we might get a trade deal, is good. This idea that you erect trade barriers with your closest neighbour, your biggest trading neighbour, to try and make up for it elsewhere in the world, it is for the birds. Economists have looked at this tiny proportion of our trade with places like Australia and New Zealand, because geography matters when you're trading. It matters that the EU is on our doorstep. It's a nuts argument, and it's one you made, and you told the public this is going to happen.
I'll let Tim have the last few minutes.
It doesn't wash.
Just really briefly, look, it is, I think, very difficult to end regulatory alignment with existing industries and existing relationships. I think the advantage of Brexit lies in new industries, the biotech and other industries that are emerging, where there aren't relationships. That's where Britain can now plough a separate deal in the future, which gives us freedom. And the EU will undoubtedly, as it always does, overload these new industries with regulations. It's those infant industries where we have the opportunities.
We're going to move on and talk about university funding, because large numbers of leading UK universities say they are at risk of falling into financial deficits. Some of them already have. Let's talk to the Chief Executive of Universities UK, Vivienne Stern. Vivienne, our viewers will think most universities are charging £9,250 a year to British UK students, and for foreign students up to £38,000 a year. Why are universities struggling financially?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is that for English universities, and that's what that fee relates to, that's been frozen for a decade. And we all know that costs have been going up during that decade, and very fast in the last couple of years. And so we've got a situation in universities where costs are rising, income is falling in real terms, and, you know, the pips are now squeaking.
In terms of foreign students, I'm just going to show our viewers this headline in the Financial Times. It was from last week. University of York lowers bar for overseas students after financial challenges. UK universities have become increasingly reliant on international students. Is that true? University of York said it didn't lower the bar, but when it comes to clearing, they were prepared to look at foreign students if their grades hadn't come in as expected, because they pay far more in fees. Is that the situation that UK universities or English universities are battling for foreign students because they pay more?
So it's definitely true that universities need foreign students to supplement the income that they get for domestic teaching, that, you know, basically to deliver the same quality to UK students, we've got to have international students, to subsidise effectively domestic teaching. The York story is a bit more complicated, and it's hard to kind of explain it briefly, and just to give you an illustration, on results day, you know, I was in UCAS head office, and we were doing lots of media to students who were holding offers at universities. And, you know, for some of those students, they just missed their grades. And the first thing we say to those UK students is, do not panic. The first thing you do if you've just missed your grades is get on the phone and call the university. All right. Because the university, if it has space, will adjust its, the grades that they will admit you in, if they've still got space, depending on circumstances. So if they're convinced you can still succeed in the course, they'll be flexible. All right. And what the York story was about was effectively the kind of floor. What they were saying is, you can't go below this, but, you know, you can admit a student who's missed their grades as long as they're above this level. But it all got a little bit lost in the kind of coverage, and I think that's what's going on here.
All right, well, let's return to the core issue, which is funding. Stay with us, Vivienne, because we've got our guests here in the studio. You accept that foreign students, to a large extent, are subsidising British students going to universities, and yet today we hear that the government is wanting to clamp down in some way or limit the number of foreign students coming here. Well, that's going to make these universities struggle even more, isn't it?
I think it is going to be a very hard circle to square. I think, as you just heard, the numbers of foreign students are in part there to support the endeavour to try and get a large number of UK students to have the standard of education that we want. This is a much broader conversation about the sustainability of the UK university sector than it is simply about foreign students.
But is it sustainable? That's the point.
Well, if the numbers of foreign students go down significantly, then that is going to put much greater pressure on the government to find other ways of allowing the sector to fund itself. Now, that could be increased fees, it could be increased support from the government itself. It could be increased involvement with the private sector as well. There are a number of ways of squaring this circle that don't require international students, but it would be a change in the business model.
Now, what would you like to see in terms of changing? I mean, would you like to see the fees go up? Should that frozen cap on 9,250 be lifted?
Well, I think it's a fair point to say that they haven't gone up for some time. However, what's the bigger problem in my mind is the amount of interest that's being charged on student loans, for instance, which hugely impacts the marginal tax rate that graduates are effectively paying. So I think there's a number of issues that any government is going to have to wrestle with, and that's before you get on to the broader conversation of what's the right proportion of apprenticeships, of university degrees, of the broader picture.
Getting rid of university tuition fees used to be Labour's policy. That's certainly what Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader, put forward. It was also one of Keir Starmer's leadership pledges. He has said a future Labour government would have no plans to abolish tuition fees because the country couldn't afford it, but there would be a fairer system. What's that going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been an ongoing debate. I personally have always preferred some sort of graduate tax scheme. I also think we do need to look at the interest rates on any of these schemes, not least because right now, if you take maternity leave, although the loan stops, the interest accrues. So actually we're penalising women who take maternity leave when they're recovering. And there's all sorts of problems with how it works. And what you're seeing here is that fundamentally our funding system is broken. I feel like the government's all over the shop on this because a few years ago they were encouraging foreign students to come here and issuing visas and saying we want you to come because it was part of the business model, and we recognised actually it wasn't just about the cash that these students brought, it was also about the research, it was about the standing and the soft power.
But Keir Starmer says he wants to ease the burden on students.
If you want to have a debate, and I think we should be having a debate about the funding across the bill, because I also look at further and higher.
What would the policy be? Easing the burden by reducing fees?
I don't think you can look at it just in terms of the final number. I think you've got to look at when you pay, who's paying, and where it goes, and what it goes towards, because some of these stories are about foundation courses, and actually one of the things the government is starting to do is cut off access to foundation courses for students who aren't from middle-class privileged backgrounds, who have parents who can also subsidise them. Foundation courses have been a lifeline to get into education at a later level. So actually the inequality in the system is also part of the conversation.
Well, I just cannot believe we're talking about asking young people to contribute more to the cost of their higher education. Like, when you take a step back, young people are paying, over a certain threshold, an extra 9% of income tax, some of them for pretty much all of their working lives. That's incredible, right? And I think when you take a step back and look at our university system, there's a couple of things to say about it. One is that it's incredibly academically stratified. Yep. So if you get 3 A's or if you get an A and 2 B's, suddenly you're sorted into different institutions to study history. There's no academic reason for that whatsoever. And it allows two things to happen. First of all, I think we have no idea which university courses are good in terms of value add, in terms of skills to students, and which are bad. The Russell Group is allowed to basically just free ride on the fact that it is selecting the most able students at A-level, and then they say, well, look, we provide great value, our students go on to do great things. Actually, we've got no idea which universities are providing great courses and which are poor courses in terms of value add. We do know that when it comes to schools, when it comes to hospitals, there will be good and bad universities. We've got no idea about it. So it's not enough for the sector to say, just give us more money. We need to know how you're doing. The second thing is that because we stratify academically, we're stratifying by social class, because actually you're much more likely to get 3 A's if you're from an advantaged background. And so actually I think we've got a university system that takes the social attainment gap and embeds it in, it entrenches our class system. And it's simply not good enough. And I think universities have been allowed to sort of partake in this for too long. It's partly a government issue as well. Absolutely not. We cannot expect young people to pay more during their working life. It's outrageous.
What do you say, Viv? What do you say, Vivian, in response to what you've just heard there from Sonia?
Well, just on that point about not knowing what happens, in universities in terms of the outcomes of students, it's just not true. Like, if you go on the website of the Office for Students and you select an institution in a particular course, you can get a lot of information about.
It is true when it comes to value add. So in terms of a student's starting point and where they're finished, we've got no idea about the contribution of a degree to skills formation. We know their outcomes in the labour market, for example. We know how many firsts there is, but it's not true to say that we know the value of a degree in terms of skills formation.
Let Vivian respond to that specifically.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the first thing is that there has been a colossal effort in the university system to widen access to the students who are, whose parents didn't go to university and from relatively modest backgrounds. We've seen, over the last few years, you take students on free school meals, for example. 15 years ago, about 12% of those students got to go to university. It's now about 24%. And when you look at what happens to them afterwards, I think we can demonstrate that university is one of the few bits of the education system that actually can take a student who's got a kind of one social background and transform their opportunities. And to the point about, do we have the evidence? Yes, we do. We can see what happens to these students in terms of their earnings. And the OFS website has information about that. But we can also actually see what happens to things like, longevity and health. There was a brilliant study in The Lancet last week that showed that every year of education you take part in extends your life.
Yes, but I suppose the question is it down to the university and the course that is attended by, or would these students have done well wherever?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure the evidence is there, which is what's being suggested. But just briefly, I mean, do you think fees will have to go up? And Vivian, I'll get your thoughts on whether you think students should be charged even more.
No, because I think when fees were introduced, I think there was a view that different universities would charge different fees. Some would perhaps move from 3-year courses to 2-year courses. There would be innovation. In fact, all universities basically charged the same amount. They provided the same for this sort of model. The university sector is ripe for massive reform. It needs to be changed, from top to bottom. And we've just been having a discussion about Brexit. People like me voted for parliamentary sovereignty, but the average person in Britain, when they voted for Brexit, they voted for change. One of the changes was they wanted massive expansion of vocational education. They wanted HS3. They wanted, the thing is, the university sector is exactly the same as it was before Brexit. It's going down exactly the same line. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, a lot of the teaching went offline. That hasn't gone back properly. It's a sector that, and at the moment, it's often a vehicle for immigration rather than for education. And
right.
So massive changes.
I'll leave that just to one side for the moment. But that is definitely the reporting that's been going on recently about universities. But do you think it's broken, Vivian? Is the system broken? The fact that the market, it isn't a market. Everyone charges the same amount. So it never, ever realised what the sort of initial vision was for university tuition fees.
Look, we've got a university system in this country which we can be genuinely proud of. We've got 4 universities in the top 10 in the international league tables. And all of the internationally comparable data shows that our higher education system is a jewel in the crown. We've got a choice, right? Do you want to keep it that way? Do you want to make it better in the future? Or do you want to run it into the sand? And that's the choice I think we're facing.
Right, so we need
to have a discussion about the funding, but the one thing that any incoming government must do is at least link the tuition fee to inflation. That's not putting it up. That's just stopping it going down.
Right. Well, that would, in effect, they'd be paying more, wouldn't they?
It would be paying more.
Not in real terms.
No, and I'm putting it to Matt. So, what do you say?
I think, look, I don't want to beat up the university sector. I think things like the Office for Students have made huge progress in a sector that is. There's no point sitting there denying that Britain has some of the best universities in the world. We should be proud of those.
We need to be thinking about teaching as well.
Absolutely, and we should be proud of them. But what we should also, I think, be saying is going to university, if you're paying for it in any sense, should be a fantastic investment in your own life going forward. And that is clearly not the case for every single course that's there right now, partly because of the standards of teaching. And universities should be reflecting on that if they're asking for more money.
Absolutely.
Vivian Stern, thank you very much for joining us. Let me show you this headline in The Guardian. Women still being harassed at abortion clinics despite buffer zone law. Last year, Parliament passed a new law to make protesting against abortion within a 150-metre safe access zone of clinics illegal. The law does not include any exemptions for silent prayer, but under draft Home Office guidance, activities including silent prayer would still be allowed. That draft guidance is subject and was subject to public consultation, which ended last week. Stella, how do you want the draft guidance to deal with the issue of silent prayer outside abortion clinics?
Oh, constitutionally, because if this goes ahead, we've got a constitutional crisis, because there is no human right to silent prayer. There's a right to religious beliefs, but not how you manifest them. More importantly, Parliament had a specific debate as to whether or not silent prayer should be allowed outside abortion clinics, and recognised that people who wanted to pray for women who are having an abortion didn't need to do it in their faces and essentially obstruct their access to an abortion clinic. So we had a debate, Parliament was given an opportunity to vote and voted against this. And it is just ironic to me, the hypocrisy of those who want to use the Human Rights Act and deny human rights to, say, refugees, but when it comes to this issue, are suddenly claiming that we cannot do what Parliament, the sovereign Parliament, wanted to do, which is to say, actually, we need to balance these rights and say women have a right to privacy, and so if you want to pray, you need to do it 150 metres away. This is going to be a constitutional crisis, because it's not that Parliament didn't consider this issue. We explicitly considered this issue, we've rejected it, and the government is still bringing it forward.
On the issue, though, of allowing anti-abortion protesters to pray silently outside clinics, outside the buffer zone, should they be allowed to do that?
Well, this is an issue I always feel hazardous to, and my side of the argument, which is anti-abortion, some of the treatment, for example, of Stella has been despicable. You know, when you were expecting your baby, you know, it was awful.
Well, they're back again.
And I'm sorry for that.
And they're leafleting 4-year-olds in my town centre. That is not public debate and protest, that's harassment.
It isn't. And we've talked about this issue before, Stella, and I think we've been able to do so in an adult way. Some of us do regard abortion as a grave moral thing that we object to.
Harm, yeah.
And the right to abortion is settled in law. The right of people who, like me, who want to protest or just try and influence a woman has to be limited by that. You know, you used the word obstruct a few moments ago. That's obviously wrong. If someone's sort of obstructing a woman's access to abortion clinic, that's wrong. But the right still to just be there, close by, because some of us do think living inside the woman going into that abortion is a real human being that, if left with time, will become just like one of us. And the fact that the British Parliament, you know, a country of great liberty, tries to restrict that, worries us a great deal. And so I hear what Stella says about Parliament, where it's been, and perhaps Parliament ultimately, of course, has to be respected. But there are reasons why some of us do still think the right to be able to protest, to pray, to inform in a respectful way is really quite important.
And on that, Sonia, we'll come to what Parliament's decided and whether the process should be followed through. But on the actual issue at the heart of this, should people be allowed to pray silently if they sincerely believe they might be helping?
Well, I very much respect Tim's right to his own moral view on this. It is an issue of conscience. We obviously disagree quite strongly on it. But what I would say around these exclusion zones is they're only 150 metres. I believe in the right to free expression. I think people do have the right to protest and to take part in democratic debate about abortion. But I don't think that extends to making a woman feel uncomfortable who's about to go in for a medical procedure. So for me, this is a very limited measure. It's a 150-metre exclusion zone. We're not saying that people can't take part in protests and silent prayers outside Parliament, for example, or outside a town hall. This is very specifically limited. We don't want there to be harm for women who are exercising their legal right to go forward and have a medical procedure.
Is there any... if, you know, people were stood outside the abortion clinic haranguing and shouting, but just you sort of saying they can do it outside Parliament, but they can't do it near an abortion. The reason why people want to be near the abortion clinic is because they do think that's the opportunity to influence women. I said, do it respectfully, provide information, but don't get in the way. You can't see why people want to do that and should be allowed to do that.
No, because I honestly think that a woman has a right to go into a clinic for a medical procedure without being told and judged by people on the way in that what she's doing is morally wrong. I think we need to have the broader moral conversation as a society, but I don't think it should be directed at women who are doing this.
This is what I don't understand. Is that absolutely, Tim, I will defend your right to oppose abortion, to have proper democratic debate. You and I have had that. What I will not defend and what I will not excuse is somehow that gives people a free pass when it comes to harassment. Women have a right to privacy, and going and having an abortion is an intensely personal thing. And it is intrusive. Why do people need to pray there? If you want to pray for people, and you've said it, you've admitted it yourself, it's because you actually want to influence them.
Yes.
That is not a neutral act. That is interfering with their rights to privacy.
I didn't say it would be neutral. And I think if they
so,
were photographing
so there we go. So
people,
whose rights matter? Well, we had that debate in Parliament, isn't it? You're right, it's a conflict, but we had that debate in Parliament. Matt and I took part in a debate, in a vote, explicitly to say, in this instance, we've balanced the rights and decided the right to religious belief does not trump the right to privacy, and so silent prayer is outlawed. You want to talk about Brexit. Brexit was all about the sovereignty of Parliament. Well, here is a sovereign Parliament making a decision that silent prayer should not be allowed, and yet this government is ignoring it. At what point do you think Parliament matters, Tim?
Well, I mean, look, Stella and I agree on this completely.
Yeah, but why has this draft guidance come out then to contradict what had been agreed?
What is frustrating about this particular situation is the previous Home Secretary brought out this guidance. We've now got a new Home Secretary who has been explicit in his commitment to deliver on what Parliament voted for. I think that's the right thing, and I think it needs to be addressed quickly. It's an immensely frustrating situation to have set this hair running when, frankly, it should never have been allowed anywhere. I completely understand where Tim is coming from, but there is a massive difference between the broader debate about abortion and anyone approaching an individual on their way to a clinic. And one, the former, absolutely fine. The latter, Parliament has said no, and I think we just need to respect that.
Right, so you think they should just allow this draft guidance to be put aside on when it comes to the issue of silent prayer?
I agree with Matt that the new Home Secretary has said, and he has said he will listen and talk because he has taken this on. But I think for many of us, and of course abortion isn't a right in the UK, it is actually still illegal in England and Wales, not in Northern Ireland. You get 2 doctors to exempt you from prosecution, and we're currently debating the decriminalisation because of the recognition that still hundreds of women are being investigated and prosecuted in some circumstances for having late-term miscarriages and having stillbirths because of these archaic laws. There is a long way to go in recognising a woman's right to privacy and a woman's right to choose in English law. We cannot have these debates and look at these very sensitive issues if those people who oppose abortion refuse to engage in democratic processes. You do, Tim, but many of these protesters, what they're doing in my constituency is undemocratic. They're harassing my constituents to harass me. And these debates are coming forward. I pay tribute to the new Home Secretary that he has agreed to sit down and talk about this, but we should never be in a position where a law that was passed a year ago, because in that time 50 clinics have been hassled by these people. Councils are still having to spend thousands of pounds that they don't have on public space protection orders. It's a mess.
Matt?
Well, I think there was, I remember the vote, there was a debate over, is this a free vote about abortion or is it a debate, or is it a vote about sort of public safety? And I, among others, went to the whips and said, look, this is clearly about abortion. This has to be a free vote. Parliament knew exactly what it was doing when it made the decision that we've been talking about today. And I think the idea that Home Office guidance would be questioning that is fundamentally really disturbing.
Where I do completely agree, once Parliament has decided, Parliament, that is sovereign. And if the Home Office are going behind the back of Parliament, that's absolutely wrong. All I'm saying is that some of us don't agree with what Parliament's decided.
And you have a right to say that, and I will always defend that.
But on that, but just to go back to the issue of silent prayer, I mean, Tim used the word influence, and that, I think, is beyond certainly what's expected by these buffer zones. But in terms of help, because women often are very vulnerable at that moment, as you say, and maybe there are cases where someone needs support and help. Is that not part of this issue of people being allowed behind the buffer to pray silently on behalf of women in a very difficult, sensitive time?
But I don't see how that provides support, practical support, because obviously it's an emotionally difficult time for some women. For other women, it isn't. We shouldn't generalise. How does silent prayer that they're not choosing help them with that? So I don't think that the walk from, your car or from public transport to the clinic is the time for people to be targeting you with their specific view that abortion is morally wrong, which they are entitled to, but they're just not entitled to impose on you under the guise of help and support. Help and support should be neutral, shouldn't judge a woman for making that decision.
Do you accept that, Tim?
I just know of someone, it's an American woman I met once in Washington on the March for Life, who had seen a picture of the unborn baby as she walked into a clinic. and she turned around and she didn't have the abortion. That, for me, is worth it.
That's all we have time for. I'll be back tomorrow for Prime Minister's Questions here at 11:15 on Politics Live, but thank you very much to all my guests for joining me today. Bye-bye.